Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free tutorial today, we're going to combine a large flat oval bead with some seed beads and a tassel drop to create a beaded tassel drop pendant. Now I think they look absolutely super, so let's head down to the board, take a closer look, and then we'll make one together. So here we have our tassel drop seed bead pendant, and I'm going to take you through each of the steps to create one of these, but let's just have a quick talk about what we're going to use. Let's pop that little baby down over there. So my focal bead, I have a 20mm faceted flat oval. Really pretty with a little bit of a coating over it. I've got some small crystal beads. They're approximately 2mm rounds, but you could use 11-0 seed beads if you prefer. I have a single optional 6-0 seed bead just to put up in the neck section of the piece, and I've also got a tassel to use as well, so you can use whichever kind of tassel you fancy. I'm kind of in a red mood this week, so I've gone for another red one just there. So the first piece of wire that we're going to use is approximately 12 to 14 inches in length, a little bit more than we need perhaps, but definitely worth having that extra just in case you change your mind with what you're going to do. So the main thing is to make sure that that is nice and warmed through to begin with. Now I'm going to be employing my round wooden ring mandrel, but you could really use any round form that you have in the home, and we're going to start dead in the centre at the bottom. I'm also going to be using a set of round nose pliers. In this case I've got my memory wire pliers. You could also use some bail makers, and I want to make a reasonably large little loop shape just down at the bottom. So I'm just going to turn that wire over. It needs to be centralised on your piece to begin with, and I've made that reasonably sized just to give me an option to add some seed beads later on, but I'll discuss with you how you can go without seed beads just at the base if you prefer. Let's just give that a bit of a squish to make sure that we've got a nice flat baseline to begin with. Now we're going to need to create an oval form above that little loop down at the base. So let's just make sure that our wire is good and toasty warm. I'm using 1mm or 18 gauge medium round copper today. And as I say, it's about 12 or so inches, maybe a little bit more if you want something fancier, or indeed if you have a larger bead than the one that I'm using. So I'm going to pop my round ring mandrel just in position to get the beginning of a curvy shape. You could use a round form of any choice that you have around the home, or you could just use your fingers to get the idea of a shape. So what I tend to do with a design like this is just get a starting point. I have a feeling it's going to be too wide, and it looks a little bit wider on the left than on the right, but it's a place to start. So I'm going to apply some warmth just to bring that in a little bit, and then we'll pop our bead in. Now we don't want it to form fit exactly around the bead, we want it to be a floating frame. So I think that's actually looking pretty reasonable. That looks okay to me. So I'm going to start to just curve the wires over at the top. Now if you didn't want to use a ring mandrel, this is the sort of action that you can take to get the curvature. Just use your hands to give that a bit of shape. You can of course use the same ring mandrel or round form as you did for the base of the design, and let's just get those crossing over. That's far too tall at the moment, and again it's wrong. It's much higher on the left than it is on the right, so you have the opportunity to just bring that down and get those to cross over at the top. So let's just pop that into position. As for right now, that looks pretty decent. I'm not going to worry about the exact shape for the time being. The next thing we're going to need to do is add our tassel into position. Now, if you prefer to work without the tassel in position because it gets on your nerves, that's absolutely fine. You can always apply a jump ring later on and connect those in together. I am going to show you how to connect that directly in if you prefer in just a moment, because what I'm going to do next is add in the finer wire. Now the finer wire I'm using today is 0.4mm or 26 gauge, and I'm going to work with quite a long length because I don't want to run out halfway through. I'm going to find the centre point. This is approximately 30 inches, which is approximately, I can't remember what that is in centimetres. But it's 26 gauge, 0.4 millimetre, 2.5 feet in length. What we're going to do is find the centre point of the finer gauge wire, just lay it over the central section where you've created that loop, and we're going to allow half of the wire to run through and just sit like so. So I've got the halfway point of my fine wire sitting just above the loop that we created. And what I'm going to do next is rotate 5 times around the right hand side. Now you can either push your wire through and pull that round 5 times. You could, if you prefer, go for 3 times between each bead, but I'm going to go for 5 times today. If you don't want to handle the wire, if you have hot hands like I do, what you can do is slide that through the little gap that's up at the top here. So whichever you prefer, and whichever means that you're handling your wire the least. So every time I do a little couple of loops there, I'm going to tighten that coil up. So I've got a 4th wrap on this side and then a 5th wrap on this side. I'm going to make sure that those are good and tight. What I'll do now is just flip this over in the opposite direction. Right now, it doesn't matter which is front or which is back. Before we add anything further, what we can do is just open this up slightly. So you can see I'm allowing that loop to be opened up at the base. If you struggle to do that, you can, of course, add a set of pliers just to hold the loop. And you can now see I've got complete access all the way down the bottom of the design to that loop. And then we can add your chosen tassel in. Now, as I said, if you didn't want to have the hassle of the tassel whilst you're working, then you can leave that and add it on later with a jump ring. But if you want it all in one, get that in there right now, because when we push that back together, just closing that up by hand is enough. What we're going to do is draw what is now the right hand wire. So I've got half my wire over on the left, and I've got those 5 rotations of wire on the left. I'm just going to try and centralise that crossover point as much as possible, and then I'm going to do 5 rotations on the right hand side as well. So as at this point, it doesn't really matter which is front and which is back. I'm just going to keep pressing those coils until they're nice and neat and tidy. Push that all the way down into position. So if you just scooch those 2 little coils up together, if you struggle to do that with your fingernails, you can very, very softly compress those coils until they sit neatly. So if I just show you on this side at the moment, we've got those 2 5 coil wraps on either side. It looks very neat and tidy. Flip it over to the other side and you can see you've got 2 5 coil wraps. So it doesn't really matter which side you want to work with for the time being. You can absolutely go in either direction unless you have a specific preferred side for your tassel. So what we're going to do next is something that's a little bit repetitive. So I'll do a couple and then I will get off the screen and do some by myself. So I think today I'm going to alternate between these very, very sexy faceted crystal beads, and I might go for a grey and then a blush pink. So if I add the first one on this side, my finer gauge wire is underneath that frame. I'm going to find the very end of the frame now, the very end of that lighter gauge wire. Allow that bead to zip line down into position. This is my least favourite part of any demonstration, because finding the hole in a teeny tiny bead is the least favourite part of jewellery making for me. There we go. Allow that to slide down into position so that it sits outside that frame. Grip the bead into position, and then we're going to wrap 5 times around the frame. Now, you do want to have some tension in your finer gauge wire, because it means that that bead will sit exactly where you want it to, just on the outside of the frame. But if you pull too hard, not only will you slightly be weakening your finer wire, but you'll also be pulling your frame out of shape. So just err on the side of caution and apply a little bit of tension when you're supporting the design. So I'm holding on to that bead whilst I'm just wrapping around 5 times. So that's 3, there's 4, and there's a 5th wrap. And I'm going to push that down really, really nice and tight. So as I mentioned, on this design, I think I'm going to alternate between my soft baby pink and my sultry coloured surface grey beads. Let's see if I can find the hole in this bead any quicker. Probably not, so don't get your hopes up. Lots of people have a technique where they have the beads on a beading mat and they press the wire down to pick them up. I've never mastered that, so there's no point in me showing it to you because it will just look rubbish. So let's add our second bead on this side. So like I said, I'm going to alternate, but you could use any seed beads that you fancy. I would think probably 11 zeros if you're going for a seed bead, or you could go for a 2mm faceted round. Really, anything that you fancy is going to work. So let's bring that second bead into position. Again, I'm going to support the bead. I'm going to cover it with my thumbnail so that when I bring the wire around that frame once and then up to 5 times, that's a third, push the wire down, keep it nice and safe, 4 times, and then that 5th time pull the wire away, scooch that neat and tidy. Now you can control how far apart your beads are. To a certain extent, if you just go for 3 wraps between each bead, they'll be a lot more clustered together, as in my demonstration piece. I think this has got 3 wraps between each of those little 11-0 orchid beads. Pop that back up in the corner, and you can also just slightly stretch those apart if you want to use fewer beads, or you can very, very softly compress them up. So what I will do is continue all the way up to around about the 1 o'clock position on the right hand side, the 11 o'clock position on the other side, and then we'll meet back here. I'm going to do the exact same thing on the left hand side. Now, to make your life easier, just turn it over to accommodate your preferred and strongest hand. So I'm right dominant, so I will just turn that over. I'll make sure that I go for a grey first, then a pink, and I'll alternate between them, but you can go whatever way the colour chooses for you. So I'll get that done and I'll meet you back in a moment. So I've continued to alternate the colours. Like I said before, you can go whichever way you want to colour-wise and even size-wise on those little beads. And I've taken care to get the form fitting. So the frame is about 1 millimetre larger all the way around than my chosen bead, which was that beautiful 20mm faceted flat oval. So we'll head back down to the board now and I'll show you how we can continue to create this piece together. So if I grab my bead and just sit that gently on top of everything else for the time being, you can see that there's a bit of a gap around the edges of the bead, and that will allow it to sit really nicely. What we're going to do now is to create an upright with one of our heavier gauge wires, one of those bits of the frame, and then the other piece of wire is going to wrap around it. So we don't want to shrink this down too much, so I've taken a moment to just get both of my finer gauge wires sitting towards the back for the time being. I don't want to cause any harm to those, so I'm just going to grab hold of that frame wire and push one of my wires upwards to create that upright at the 12 o'clock position. And every time I do something, I'm just going to make sure I haven't ruined everything or moved that frame too much, because if you take your time, you will find that even if you do deform this ever so slightly, you should be able to bring that back into true in just a moment or two. So the second wire, what we're going to do is scooch over those last 5 wraps as tightly as they can to whichever side you choose to work. And I'm going to bring this wire upwards slightly. Just grab that wire and tilt it ever so slightly up. It's only about 30 degrees or so. And that just means that when I start to wrap this tail around that central core, it shouldn't bring everything on the wonk. We should be able to keep that a nice true oval rather than losing that shape slightly. So when we grab a hold again of just past that angle change we just made, I'm going to push the wire forwards, and that is going to become the section that wraps around the tail. Now, just to tie this together for the time being, I'm going to very firmly hold this section in my non-dominant hand and bring this tail around. We're just going to tie it together for now, so we'll just go for 2 wraps. Just make sure that everything looks good and we've kept that oval, and indeed that we can still fit our central bead in the middle. That all looks good for right now, so we'll do something else with that in a moment. I'm just going to give it a warm through. Now, just as an aside, if you wanted to make a bail with 2 wires and weave between them in a figure of 8 fashion, you could take this time to just separate out the wires. Take your central core wire ever so slightly to the left, bring the tail wire over here so that it sits equal and opposite, and then you can do yourself a woven bail if that's what you would prefer to do. As at right now, we're going to set our faceted oval bead in the centre. So what I'm going to do is just very, very gently pull my wires through, making sure that I'm not pulling too hard. So we've got 2 of those finer gauge wire tails just coming all the way at the front now. Just very, very softly making sure that they sit together up at the top. Now I'm not going to twist them together because that can in fact weaken your wires and make your work come apart earlier than it ought to, which we're hoping is never. So let's find the tails of these 2 wires. So these are both 0.4mm or 26 gauge wires, and both of these will fit inside my bead really nicely. You can check if they're going to fit by trying it on one of the 1mm core wires, and if it fits on there without a drama, it will absolutely positively fit on these 2 wires very easily too. So we're going to just sit that neatly down for the second and assess how everything's looking. If you wanted to at this stage elevate the bead up, you can add another seed bead down on these 2 wires, but I quite like the fact that it's a little bit mobile. So what we're going to do is take the left one over to the left, the right one over to the right, and I'm going to use the loop down at the base of the design just to post that first one through, and I'll do exactly the same thing on both sides, but I'll just show you on the one side. So because our wire's seen a little bit of action, you can see it's getting a tiny bit ahead of itself, so just very, very softly encourage that to come through. We can, if it's easier for you to imagine what's going to happen next, pull that second wire through the loop as well, taking care not to overhandle your finer wire nor to kink it. So we've got both of those tail wires coming through now at that lowest loop. And what I'm going to do here is wrap 5 times around the looped section. And when you do the first wrap, we just need to make sure that we get that tight up as high as we can on that looped shape. And I'll go for 5 wraps so that it replicates what we did on the main section, the main frame. You may need to go for a couple of wraps before you have opportunity to just tighten those wraps neatly. So that's 3 so far. Now at this stage, if you wanted to, you can simply go for those 5 wraps and cut away. But I quite like the idea of having another couple of beads. So I'm going to continue with my alternating pattern. Just make sure that you're happy with those wraps because it's difficult to alter them lately. I'm just going to ensure that that's neat and tidy and that I'm happy with the tension and that all of those coils are nice and smooth. So that looks pretty decent. So in order to keep going with my pattern, I've got a grey one at the lowest point. So I think I'll add a pink one just here. Let's grab one of those little babies from the bowl. And these are approximately 2mm beads. And again, it's always fun to watch me get beads on. There we go. So just scooching your little wraps up for the last time, pop your bead into position, and you're going to repeat the exact same technique. So support your bead, and then you're going to wrap. If you chose 3 times on the main section of your design, then stick with that. So therefore I would go for 5 wraps, but I'll just get 1 wrap in position, scooch it up neatly before I continue, making sure that you don't accidentally cross that over with your other long tail wire. Now you could just add 1 bead, you could, as I mentioned before, simply trim away. I'm going to go for 5 wraps and then a second bead, and then I'll repeat the exact same thing on the other side. So I've continued adding 2 beads on the loop on either side down at the bottom. Now it got very tight in there. So I've just finished off with 3 wraps at the end of the wires, the finer gauge wires, instead of 5 because that's all that would fit. And I've just made sure there's no sticky uppy bits. So let's head back down to the board and see what we're going to do next. So here's our design so far. We've got that little halo of seed beads sitting around. We've got that lovely little loop down at the bottom with that tassel in. Now we're just going to finish off the neck section of the piece. So when you do continue, if you choose not to go for that woven bail, but if you want a simplistic bail, just be careful that you don't disrupt the shape of your oval form. So at this stage, I'm going to add in one of my other beads. Now this is I think it was a 6-0 seed bead in a complementary colour. I'm just going to allow that to slide down onto the core wire, making sure that everything is really, really warm before we proceed, because what I don't want to do is to smash the seed bead. So let's give that a good heating through. And then I'm taking the wrapping wire around that core from the face, the upper side of my core wire. And I'm going to support my bead and just draw that across the back. And it's just adding a little bit of embellishment to that upside section. And again, I'm going to go for the same number of wraps above the bead as I had below. So let's just draw that across and see what that looks like. So I've got 3 wraps and 3 wraps. I think that's enough on that neckline section. So what we're going to do now is to create a bail. So as you can see, the orientation of the pendant is this way. So we need to bring the wire forwards now to generate our bail. Now you can go for whatever size bail you fancy. I very much like to go for large bails because it gives me an option to use ribbons as necklaces. So I'm going to create a gap between the wrapping and where I'm going to put the bend, which is a 90-degree forwards bend. Now you can use whatever round form you like, a pen or your bail making pliers, or a pencil, whatever. So I'm going to go for number 5 on my bail makers just to create that round form. Draw that all the way around. And then just check that that's round enough for you. Give it a squish to make sure it's nice and flat. And what I tend to do at this stage is just give it a little bit of a gentle squishing with those pliers to make sure that that round shape is kept. I'm just going to draw the other tail wire, beg pardon, all the way down and out the way. Make sure that I'm happy with the tightness of that coil. You can tighten that up, but can you see I'm using my thumbnail to protect the bead so I don't put any undue pressure on it or accidentally smash it, because it's really tricky to kind of take everything apart and replace that if we break it right now. So let's support across that round form and fill in this gap. Now what can happen at this stage is you'll find that you start eating away by pulling this section of wire around the core. So do try and hold on to that quite firmly. You can use 2 pairs of pliers to do this job if you prefer, and you'll probably be able to do a much neater job than I'm doing right now. So I've crossed my wires over, so I'm just going to undo that ever so slightly, and rather than cutting the video, I'm going to show you how to fix it. So what we can do is just undo, make sure that the wire then moves down below the preceding coil, flip that back over, and then just push everything up to exactly where you want it to be. You might need to take a second to do that, and then continue on your merry way, wrapping around the core until you get a slightly neater version of what we have on the lower side. So bring that around until you fill the gap. And again, you can spend a little bit more time than I am right now, just making sure that that sits neatly. So what I like to do when I've got 2 long tail wires sticking out like so is to create some coils. Now you can have one going up and one going down, or you could have one on the front and one on the back, whichever you prefer. That you have probably seen a bajillion times with me, so I'm just going to push those up and out of the way for a second. All you'd need to do is trim these to your desired length, create yourself a little coil and sit it wherever you want to sit it, basically. I do just want to show you a little bit of a fix. If you elected to not pop a bead down here at the bottom, but afterwards you think, actually, I'd quite like the thing to sit a little bit higher, then you can fix this with a crimp cover. So I've just got a little silver coloured one here, and I'm going to make sure that that fits all the way around both of those wires. Now this is a little bit tricky to show you, but not tricky to achieve. So make sure that you cover both of those wires. Let's turn it up the other way. And when you crimp this closed, just make sure that you don't crush those fine wires inside the closing jaws. Like I said, it's not impossible to do, it's just tricky to show you. So just take your time and close that up. Either that or just use a seed bead halfway through the procedure when I mentioned it. I just wanted to show you that there are often ways to change the looks of things if you're not entirely happy. Now I happen to think that looks a million times better with that little crimp cover on. And it will also protect the wires slightly, but do make sure that you don't accidentally crush those fine wires. I think that looks lovely, and I'll probably just add some coils on here in a moment and just make sure that I'm happy with that wrapping. Take your time and you'll do a much neater job. I'll take a photo of both of these in a moment and leave it on the video outro. So thanks for joining me today for this free wirework tutorial here on YouTube. I hope you have enjoyed the Tassel Drop Seed Bead Pendant. I'm also going to add a quick photo in a moment when I finish this of a design without that central oval bead. So you can just kind of create any form that you like, add some beads around the edge and then just go for your life in that fashion too. Enjoy the rest of your day and I look forward to seeing you back here on the Gemhawks YouTube channel. Please do take a moment to like the video if you're enjoying the content. Dropping a subscription does enable us to be seen much more easily by the wider community. Have a beautiful day. Bye.